The May 9, 2024 military parade became a disgrace for Russia. A vast number of statements and events surrounded the May 9th military parade in Moscow, held in honor of the Soviet Union's victory in World War II, the scale of which completely failed to match the meager scope of the parade itself. The Moscow parade became historically the shortest in its history, conducted without equipment and without significant foreign leaders. Perhaps the only new development was the appearance of North Korean soldiers who had been fighting against Ukraine on Moscow's side. Let's break down the main events surrounding this event in Moscow. Chronology of events and statements. April 29th. Following a conversation with Putin, Trump stated that he discussed a small truce regarding Ukraine. Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, claimed that Putin proposed a temporary ceasefire specifically for the May 9th holiday period, and Trump reportedly reacted positively. May 4th. Russia announced a unilateral truce for May 8th and 9th, tied to Victory Day, while simultaneously threatening a massive missile strike on central Kyiv if Ukraine attempted to disrupt the celebrations in Moscow. May 4th. In Yerevan, Zelenskyy stated that for the first time in many years, Russia was planning a parade in Moscow without military hardware because it fears drones. He called on Europe to maintain sanctions pressure, particularly against Russian oil, the military industry, and banks. May 5. Germany urged Russia to accept the Ukrainian proposal for an immediate ceasefire. German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul stated that Zelenskyy once again demonstrated Ukraine's readiness for a truce and negotiations. Norway also supported the Ukrainian call for immediate silence, stating that Russia could cease attacks against Ukraine and civilians at any moment. May 5. Russia tightened security ahead of the parade. It temporarily restricted mobile internet and disrupted airport operations. The parade in Moscow was set to take place without heavy military equipment for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The night of May 5th-6th, Kyiv introduced its own truce starting at 0000 on May 6th. Zelenskyy stated that Russia had not ceased any form of military activity. Reports were coming in of strikes in the Donetsk, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Sumy, Chernihiv, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions. He emphasized that Ukraine would act reciprocally. May 6th. Russian threats towards diplomats began. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova urged foreign diplomatic missions to evacuate personnel from Kyiv in the event of a massive Russian strike should Moscow decide to retaliate for attempts to disrupt May 9th. The eve of the parade, Russia began moving air defense systems from the regions to Moscow, forming additional defensive rings around the capital. The Ukrainian side stated that this showed the Kremlin cared more about the parade than the truce, and that such movements created additional opportunities for Ukrainian long-range strikes. The European Commission, in turn, stated it would not evacuate diplomats from Kyiv, despite Russian threats, calling them part of Russia's escalatory tactics. What the parties actually wanted. Moscow wanted a short pause tied to May 9th, but accompanied it with threats to Kyiv. Peskov announced additional security measures for Putin due to a terrorist threat from Ukraine. The parade would be scaled down without the traditional demonstration of tanks and missiles. Ukraine insisted on a real truce, not an hour of safety for a parade. Zelenskyy stated that Ukraine was ready to ensure complete silence starting May 6, but received new Russian strikes and threats in return. He also advised foreign representatives against traveling to Moscow for the parade. Trump supported the idea of a short pause in his conversation with Putin, but Ukraine is conducting separate negotiations with representatives of the U.S. president regarding humanitarian issues, the restoration of the diplomatic process, and security arrangements. Germany, Norway, and Estonia effectively supported the Ukrainian logic. If Russia can declare silence for a parade, it can agree to a real ceasefire. Estonian Minister Margus Tsahkna stated that the violation of the Ukrainian truce shows that Moscow cares not about peace, but about its parade. On May 8th, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelenskyy signed Decree No. 374/2026 on the holding of a parade in the city of Moscow. The document explicitly stated, permit the holding of a parade in the city of Moscow on May 9th, 2026. And for the duration of the parade, the territorial square of Red Square was excluded from the deployment plan for Ukrainian weaponry. This was not just a formal diplomatic gesture within the framework of agreements on silence and prisoner exchanges, but also a very powerful information strike. The Kremlin found itself in a situation where its main sacred show looked as if it were taking place only because Kyiv permitted it. The May 9th parade was meant to demonstrate Russia's strength, but effectively showed its fear. Moscow held it in a scaled-down format, without the usual display of tanks, missiles, and heavy equipment, citing the current operational situation and the threat of Ukrainian strikes. Reuters wrote that the parade took place without the traditional demonstration of armaments, and even before May 9th, the Kremlin was tightening Putin's security and placing Moscow on high alert. In other words, instead of an imperial spectacle of power, the Kremlin got a parade of restrictions: nervous security, fear of drones, a truncated program, the absence of key military equipment, and a public admission that Ukraine is capable of influencing even the main symbolic ritual of the Putin regime. In this sense, the victory parade turned into a parade of vulnerability. It is especially important to emphasize, Moscow tried to use the theme of a truce for the safety of its own parade, but even on the days it called days of silence, the Russian army did not stop the war. Zelenskyy stated on May 10th that while there were no massive missile or air attacks that day, there was no peace in frontline communities. Over yesterday and today, there were more than 150 assault actions, over 100 shellings, and nearly 10,000 kamikaze drone strikes. He stated directly that the Russian army does not observe the silence and doesn't even particularly try. Reuters also reported on May 11th that Ukrainian military and regional officials recorded Russian drone strikes and combat engagements despite the May 9th to 11th truce. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, there were 180 combat engagements in the previous 24 hours, and Russian forces used over 8,000 kamikaze drones against settlements and military positions. Moscow asked for silence, not for peace, but for a parade. Ukraine provided the opportunity not to strike Red Square because the lives of Ukrainian prisoners and the exchange agreement were more important than a symbolic strike. But the Kremlin used these days not for a real end to the war, but for a propaganda show, while simultaneously continuing assaults, shellings, and drone attacks.
That is why May 9th, 2026 became not a demonstration of strength, but a demonstration of fear, dependency, and political humiliation of the Kremlin. Thank you for watching. Stay on the side of good. Subscribe to the channel. Glory to Ukraine.